So we continue with part 2 of our lesson on industrial activity. So now we look briefly at industrial accidents. So we're still looking at a big picture with regards to industrialization. So since the evolution and development of industrialization across the world, we find that globally there has been an historic increase in the number of factories or number of factories and manufacturing industries, and the use of machinery to facilitate the production activities at these facilities. Related to that, there has been a corresponding increase in the use of unskilled labor, including child labor. We find even today there's a lot of that that's taking place around the world. For example, you find a significant amount of use of unskilled labor and child labor in places like China and India. And as a result, as you can imagine, there would also be a concern for workplace safety. So related to industrialization, you find working conditions during the Industrial Revolution were absolutely terrible. So that was in the early days of industrialization. Many horrible accidents took place, a lot of workplace deaths, a lot of incidents that caused harm and injury to individuals during that period. And with all the horrible working conditions, as a result, coming out of that, you found a lot of protests and riots taking place of the workers against those that they felt were in control and did not hear their cries. So you find that labor unions were formed as a result, and the main goal of the labor unions is to protect and further the rights and interests of their members, right? So it really was a very honorable goal when it started. So working conditions in Trinidad and Tobago at present are governed by our Occupational Safety and Health Act. And as most of you, I think at this point, should be somewhat familiar with this piece of legislation. You know, this legislation defines the rights and responsibilities of the workers as well as the employers. So this has been clearly defined in the act. Let us look briefly at the industrial land cover for Trinidad and Tobago for the period 1991 to 2011. So what we find is the largest increase in industrial land cover, so that's the amount of land space allocated to industrial activity occurring during this period, occurred in the southeast region of Trinidad. This occurred due to the presence of the oil industry and other petroleum related industries growing in that area, because we find a lot of in terms of the petroleum industry, a lot of offshore activity taking place in that region. We also find industrial land cover is also recorded for the southwest region, such as in La Brea, with the presence of LNG at Point Fortin, liquid natural gas. We also find the northwest region of Trinidad shows no significant change after 2001, and this may be related to the fact that there's a growing shortage of suitable land for this type of activity in that region. Because remember, this region is, for many years, has been highly and densely urbanized. And then we also have the issue that we have the northern range situated there as well. So highland regions are also not suitable for industrial activities. There is also no substantial change in the industrial land cover for the central region. We know typically what we find happening in the central region, central west region, is a lot of urbanization taking place. There is no industrial land cover recorded for the northeast part of Trinidad, although we are aware that there are mining activities such as the quarrying, extraction of sand and gravel that is occurring in the northeast areas of Trinidad. And then the amount of industrial land cover has remained unchanged for the south central region. So this is what our industrial land cover profile looks like. So let us look at land use planning for sustainable industrial based economies. So greater control is necessary when planning the location of industrial activities, because we know industrial activities oftentimes would produce a lot of hazardous waste. So you must choose the location very carefully, and this would be related to not only your land cover characteristics, but also the characteristics of the activities and the type of industrial activities intended. So to be economically viable, industries need to be sited where they can have access to main transportation routes and to sources of labor. So these are major important input that are required for industrial activities to succeed. Strategies should allow decisions to be made about the location of major hazardous installations and about the development of the land about them. So it must be carefully considered. You have to look at all the potential environmental impacts when you have to make a determination for the location of industrial activities, particularly if you can, if it is a type of hazardous activity. So in an ideal world, industries using large quantities of hazardous substances would be located far away from centers of housing and other developments which would be affected in case of accident. So that's in an ideal world. Now remember, Trinidad and Tobago is a small island. By virtue of being a small island, land space becomes a critical issue for us. So this ideal situation doesn't really hold water for us too much. So we have to find wise strategies for identifying suitable locations for hazardous activities. That being said, let's look briefly at two approaches that are used in land use planning in order to site industrial activities. Both approaches have been used in Europe, so we have two examples there. On the left, the strategy highlighted here is the limited land and high population density. So this is one that had been applied in the UK and in Netherlands. And then to the right, we look at another approach where you have larger land masses or larger land available and reduced population density. This has been an approach that has been used in Germany. So let's look at the one on the left first. So this approach is characterized by the fact that it focuses on consequences and probabilities of hazards. It requires a systematic risk assessment approach to be taken regarding the hazards. Each case, each instance, so it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Each case is addressed according to the particular situation. You must have mandatory consultation with health, safety, and environment professionals. Right, so these professionals will interact directly with your land use planners. So what you really have happening here is the planning process becomes multi-disciplinary. So you must have health and safety and environment professionals involved in the planning process. And you also have individual and societal risk considerations that are taken. It's taken very seriously as part of the planning decision making. So you have to look at how can any of these risks, hazardous risks that I've identified, how can it impact not only the individuals working at the facility, but the nearby communities. How can they be affected? So this is requires a very comprehensive and very holistic approach to the planning process, where you have limited land space and high population densities. So this is one actually that would be very an approach that would be very relevant to the Trinidad and Tobago situation. On the other hand, you have the other approach where you have larger land space and reduced population density. This is a deterministic approach. You look at events that that are caused by external causes, external factors. Effect-based assessment, risk assessment. So you're looking at the you're addressing the risk and looking at the risk and how this can affect everything around you. A major part of this approach involves traditional zoning systems, which requires strict separation of industrial and residential areas. So you have your distinct land use zones, and that must be managed and controlled carefully. But again, when you consider this, this approach is the ideal situation. But for many places, especially small islands like Trinidad, this would not be sufficient. Right? The risk-based approach for Trinidad, particularly in areas where there would be settlements, residential settlements in near proximity, it is critical that you take a very strategic and holistic approach. So thank you for joining me for today's lesson. Please proceed to the activity that has been provided for this week. Thank you.